For more of this kind of content, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. The metallic taste of adrenaline clung to Benjamin's tongue as he regained consciousness. His head throbbed, his limbs heavy against the smooth, cold surface of the alien floor. The last thing he remembered was his ship, the Vanguard Explorer, jerking violently as it was pulled into the gravity well of an uncharted planet. Systems failing, alarms blaring, a blinding light as his escape pod jettisoned and plunged into the dense atmosphere below. Now he was here, wherever here was. The room around him shimmered like liquid crystal, its walls pulsating faintly with light, as though alive. The air carried a faint floral aroma, laced with something metallic. Strange, yet intoxicating. Benjamin forced himself upright, his fingers brushing against the seamless surface beneath him. His pulse quickened when he realized he wasn't alone. She stood at the far end of the room, her silhouette backlit by the luminous wall. Her blue skin glowed softly in the ambient light, her orange hair cascading over her shoulders like living fire. Her figure impossibly balanced, every curve intentional, was framed by a sleek, form-fitting gown that clung to her body as though it were painted on. Her piercing blue eyes locked onto his, with a mix of curiosity and unmistakable dominance. Benjamin's instincts screamed at him to stand, to present himself as anything but vulnerable, but his legs didn't comply fast enough. The woman tilted her head, a smirk playing at her lips as she took deliberate steps toward him, her bare feet silent against the glassy floor. "Human," she said, her voice a smooth melody with an undertone of command. "You wake." "Where am I?" Benjamin asked, his voice rough from dehydration and confusion. He sat straighter, his green eyes darting around for clues. "Who are you?" "I am Princess Mila," she said, stopping a few paces away. Her gaze swept over him, assessing. "You are in my domain now, human. A rare and unexpected guest." Benjamin forced a smirk, despite the unease prickling at the back of his neck. "Guest? Feels more like a prisoner situation to me." Her lips curled, revealing a hint of sharp teeth. "Prisoner, guest. The distinction depends entirely on your cooperation." "And if I don't cooperate?" he asked, his tone defiant. Her smirk widened. "Then you'll find yourself very uncomfortable." She leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "But I suspect discomfort is not something you're accustomed to, is it, Benjamin?" His name on her lips startled him. He hadn't told her. Hell, he didn't even know how she could have known it. His jaw tightened as he pushed himself to his feet, towering over her by several inches. But if Mila was intimidated, she didn't show it. Instead, she took a step closer, bridging the distance between them until they were only inches apart. "Listen, Princess," Benjamin began, his voice low and firm. "I don't know what kind of game this is, but I have no intention of sticking around to find out. Point me to the nearest exit." Mila's laugh was soft, but filled with mirth. She reached out, her fingers brushing the front of his shirt. The touch sent a spark of warmth through his chest that he couldn't explain. "Bold," she mused, "but misguided. You misunderstand the nature of our arrangement, human. You see, your ship trespassed into our system. By the laws of my people, that makes you mine." "Yours?" Benjamin repeated, incredulous. "I don't recall signing any contracts." "Your very presence here is the agreement," Mila replied smoothly. Her hand lingered against his chest, her nails lightly grazing his skin through the fabric. "And I've decided you will serve me, not just as a tool to decipher human curiosity, but as something far more personal." His green eyes narrowed, tension rippling through his frame. "And if I say no?" Her expression hardened, her hand dropping away. The playful warmth in her gaze was replaced by a cold certainty. "Then you will find yourself at the mercy of my guards, who are far less forgiving than I." Benjamin clenched his fists. He was no stranger to danger, but this situation was spiraling beyond his control faster than he could keep up. He needed a plan, an angle to outwit her. "And what exactly do you want from me?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with a warning. Mila smiled again, but this time it was softer, more enigmatic. She stepped back, gesturing toward the glimmering table in the center of the room. A spread of alien delicacies, their colors glowing faintly, lay atop it. "Sit," she commanded, her tone brooking no argument. "Eat, drink. You'll need your strength." "For what?" Benjamin asked, unmoving. Mila turned to him, her gaze smoldering. "For the games we're about to play." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Benjamin's heart pounded as he weighed his options. He wasn't sure if Mila was toying with him, testing him, or something else entirely. But one thing was clear. She held all the cards, and he had no choice but to play along. For now. Benjamin leaned back in the crystalline chair, the smooth surface oddly comfortable despite its alien design. He watched Mila with guarded eyes as she gracefully slid into her seat across from him. The alien delicacies spread out on the table glimmered in soft hues of blue and gold, but his appetite was far from present. He wasn't about to let his guard down, not in front of her. Mila's eyes danced with amusement as she reached for a glowing orb-shaped fruit. "You're staring, Benjamin," she said, her voice teasing. "Do I intrigue you that much?" Benjamin smirked, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "I'm trying to figure out what you want from me, Princess. You don't exactly strike me as the type to bring someone here for casual conversation." Mila bit into the fruit, its juice dripping onto her lips, before she licked it away with deliberate slowness. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze locked on him as if testing his resolve. "You're not wrong," she said finally. "I didn't bring you here for something as mundane as conversation. Then why don't you stop playing games and tell me?" Benjamin challenged, his tone edged with frustration. Mila tilted her head, her fiery orange hair cascading over her shoulder like molten metal. "Because where's the fun in that?" she replied. "You humans, you thrive on mystery, don't you? The unknown, the forbidden. That's what makes you so fascinating." Benjamin folded his arms across his chest. "Fascinating enough to keep me locked up like a caged animal?" Mila's lips curled into a slow, sultry smile. "Oh, you're far more than that, Benjamin. You're a puzzle, one I intend to solve." Her words sent a shiver down his spine, though he masked it with a scoff. "And how exactly do you plan to solve me?" She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as her voice dropped to a whisper. "By unraveling you piece by piece, learning what drives you, what tempts you, what makes your pulse race." Her gaze flickered to his throat for a split second before meeting his eyes again. "And maybe," she added, her tone softer now, almost playful, "what makes you surrender?" Benjamin shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. The heat in her words was subtle but undeniable, and the way she looked at him, as though she could see straight through him, was enough to make even someone as confident as he waver. "Let's get something straight," he said, leaning forward. "I'm not one of your subjects. I'm not here to entertain you, and I sure as hell don't plan on surrendering anything." Mila arched a brow, clearly unimpressed by his bravado. "We'll see," she said simply, her tone laced with intrigue. "But tell me, Benjamin, are you always this combative, or is it just with me? You don't exactly make it easy to relax." He shot back. She chuckled, a rich melodic sound that seemed to fill the room. "Perhaps I like you better this way. Strong, defiant. It's rare for me to find someone who doesn't cower in my presence." Benjamin allowed himself a small smile. "Well, you haven't met many humans then." "True," Mila admitted, her expression softening. "But you're different. You carry yourself with an arrogance that's refreshing." "Arrogance?" Benjamin echoed, feigning offense. "I prefer to call it confidence." "Confidence," Mila repeated, as though tasting the word. "Yes, I suppose that fits. But confidence without caution can be dangerous, Benjamin." "Is that a threat?" he asked, his voice low. Mila shook her head, her eyes glinting with something unreadable. "A warning," she said. "You've stepped into a world where everything you know means nothing. The rules here are mine, and if you don't learn to adapt..." She trailed off, letting the weight of her words sink in. Benjamin leaned back, studying her. "You seem pretty confident yourself, Princess. But don't mistake my cooperation for submission. I'm playing your game because I don't have a choice, not because I want to." Mila's smile widened, and she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Oh, Benjamin," she purred, "you haven't even begun to play." The tension in the room was almost tangible, an electric charge that neither of them could ignore. Benjamin's pulse quickened as Mila stood, her movements fluid and deliberate. She walked around the table, stopping just behind him. He felt her presence before he saw her, the warmth of her body radiating against his back. Her fingers brushed against his shoulder, light as a feather, but the contact sent a jolt through him. "You're tense," she observed, her voice soft and teasing. "Is it me, or are you always this tightly wound?" Benjamin turned his head slightly, catching her gaze out of the corner of his eye. "You're not exactly a calming presence." Mila laughed softly, her breath warm against his ear. "Good," she said. "I'd hate to think I've lost my touch." Her fingers lingered for a moment longer before she stepped away, leaving Benjamin both relieved and frustrated. He didn't know whether he wanted to throttle her or something else entirely. The thought made him curse under his breath. Mila returned to her seat, her expression unreadable. Rest, Benjamin, she said, her tone abruptly changing to something gentler. Tomorrow, we'll begin in earnest. Begin what? He asked, his voice sharp. Her smile returned, but this time it was softer, almost wistful. You'll see, she said. For now, just know this. You may think you're playing along, but every step you take, every move you make, you're falling deeper into my world. Benjamin didn't reply. He didn't trust himself to. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with possibilities and the unsettling realization that Mila might be right. He was in her world now, and the rules were hers to make. The bed was enormous, suspended slightly above the crystalline floor by a soft, humming energy field. Its surface seemed to shimmer and shift under Benjamin's weight, molding to him like a warm embrace. The material was unlike anything he'd ever felt before, soft as silk, yet firm enough to support his body. But none of that comfort mattered because he wasn't there by choice. Mila sat at the edge of the bed, her fiery orange hair cascading over her bare shoulders, her blue skin glowing faintly in the dim, ambient light of her chambers. She wore a loose, flowing garment that clung to her curves in ways that seemed almost deliberate, and her piercing blue eyes were fixed on him with a mixture of amusement and something far more predatory. Benjamin sat stiffly near the center of the bed, his green eyes darting toward the door, though he already knew there was no escape. The shimmering force field that guarded her chambers ensured that. Still, he wasn't one to give up easily. I don't belong here, he said finally, his voice sharp but steady. Whatever you think you're doing, princess, I'm not going to play along. Mila's lips curved into a slow smile. You misunderstand, Benjamin. You're not here to play. You're here because I want you here. She shifted closer, the bed barely dipping under her weight as though it responded only to her. And you'll stay here until I'm satisfied. Benjamin stiffened, his jaw tightening. Satisfied with what? She tilted her head, her expression playful, yet undeniably commanding. With you, of course. Your skills, your spirit, and your company. Her words sent a ripple of heat through him, though he quickly masked it with a scowl. If you think I'm going to just lie here and... Mila cut him off with a low laugh, her voice a sultry melody that seemed to echo in the enclosed space. Oh, Benjamin, she said, her eyes glinting with mischief. You think far too literally. I'm not asking for your compliance. I'm taking it. She reached out, her fingers brushing his forearm. The touch was light, almost teasing, but it sent a jolt of warmth up his arm. Benjamin pulled back instinctively, his green eyes narrowing. I'm not some toy you can play with, he snapped, his voice taut with defiance. Her smile didn't falter. If anything, it deepened. No, she said softly, leaning closer. You're much more than that. A challenge, a puzzle, and I do so enjoy unraveling puzzles. Benjamin shifted away, the bed beneath him conforming to his movements as though it were alive. You don't know anything about me. Mila's eyes darkened slightly, her playful demeanor giving way to something more serious. I know enough, she said. I know you're brave, strong, stubborn. She reached out again, this time cupping his face with surprising gentleness. And I know that no matter how much you fight it, there's a part of you that's curious, a part of you that wants to know where this will lead. He didn't pull away this time, though his muscles remained tense. Her touch was warm, almost comforting, but it carried an undeniable weight, a quiet power that demanded his attention. You're wrong, he said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. Am I? Mila asked, her tone softening. Her thumb brushed along his jawline, sending another shiver down his spine. Tell me, Benjamin, if you truly wanted to escape, why haven't you tried harder? He scoffed, finally pulling away from her touch. Because there's a force field blocking the door. What do you expect me to do? Run through it? Mila laughed again, a rich, melodic sound that seemed to fill the room. Oh, you could try, she said, but we both know you're still here because you're intrigued. You want to see how far this will go. You want to see me. The words struck a nerve, and Benjamin's gaze hardened. You're awfully sure of yourself, princess. She leaned back, her expression smug. Confidence suits me, don't you think? Benjamin rolled his eyes, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at his lips. Despite himself, he couldn't deny the strange pull he felt toward her. She was maddeningly confident, infuriatingly playful, and undeniably captivating. He hated it, but he couldn't ignore it. You're impossible, he muttered, lying back on the bed and staring up at the crystalline ceiling. Mila shifted closer, lying beside him with a grace that seemed effortless. And yet, here you are, she said, her voice low and teasing. She propped herself up on one elbow, her fiery hair spilling over her shoulder as she gazed down at him. "Tell me, Benjamin, what do you dream of?" He turned his head to look at her, his green eyes narrowing. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one," she replied. "Surely someone as strong and defiant as you has dreams, desires, passions." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Ah," Mila said softly, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "You're afraid to answer. You think I'll use it against you. Wouldn't you?" Benjamin shot back. Mila considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "Perhaps. But perhaps I'd understand you better. And understanding, Benjamin, is far more powerful than control." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Benjamin turned his gaze back to the ceiling, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm. He didn't trust her, not entirely, but there was something about her that made him want to, and that was more dangerous than anything else. For now, he would stay. He would bide his time, play her game, and figure out her intentions. But one thing was certain. This was far from over. Mila's soft laughter broke the silence, and Benjamin glanced at her, his green eyes meeting her piercing blue ones. "What's so funny?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, her smile widening. "I just enjoy watching you wrestle with yourself. It's endearing." He groaned, closing his eyes. "You're insufferable. And yet," Mila said, lying back beside him, her voice a soft purr, "you're still here, in my bed, exactly where I want you to be." Benjamin didn't respond. He wasn't sure he could, because for the first time in his life, he didn't know whether to run or stay. Benjamin awoke to a strange warmth beside him, and for a brief, disorienting moment, he forgot where he was. The soft glow of the crystalline walls and the faint hum of the bed's energy field reminded him. He wasn't aboard the Vanguard Explorer. He wasn't even on Earth. He was Mila's, prisoner, guest, plaything. He turned his head, and there she was. Mila lay beside him, her fiery orange hair spilling over the bed's shimmering surface. She looked almost peaceful, her face relaxed, her blue skin glowing faintly in the dim light. It struck him how human she looked, despite her alien features. There was something about her that was undeniably captivating, maddeningly so. As if sensing his gaze, Mila's eyes fluttered open. She caught him staring, and a slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. "Enjoying the view, Benjamin?" He grunted, sitting up and running a hand through his dark hair. "Didn't realize I had much of a choice." "You always have a choice," she said, propping herself up on one elbow. "It's just that some choices have consequences." Benjamin shot her a sharp look. "Let me guess. Refusing to stay in your bed isn't one of the acceptable options." Mila chuckled, her voice low and smooth. "Not until I'm satisfied." "And what exactly does that mean?" he asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "What do you want from me, Mila?" Her smile softened, her playful demeanor giving way to something more serious. She sat up, crossing her legs gracefully as she faced him. "I told you already. I want to understand you, to learn about what drives you, what tempts you. Humans are fascinating creatures, so full of contradictions, strength and fragility, courage and fear. You're like a storm, Benjamin, unpredictable and untamed." "You say that like it's a compliment," he muttered. "It is," she said simply, "but it's also a challenge, and I do so love a challenge." Benjamin leaned back on his elbows, his green eyes narrowing as he studied her. "So that's all this is to you? A challenge?" Mila tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps, or perhaps it's something more." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Benjamin's pulse quickened, despite himself, and he hated the way her presence seemed to unnerve him, to make him question his every move. He wasn't used to feeling this out of control. "Well, if you're looking for answers, you're going about it the wrong way," he said, his tone sharp. "Keeping me here against my will isn't exactly the best way to get me to open up." Mila's smile returned, a sly curve of her lips. "Who said anything about you being here against your will?" She leaned closer, her blue eyes locking onto his. "You could try to leave, Benjamin, but we both know you won't." "Don't flatter yourself," he shot back. "You've got me trapped behind a force field." "True," she admitted, her gaze unwavering. "But even without it, would you really go? Would you walk away from the chance to uncover what we could be?" Her words sent a ripple of heat through him, though he quickly masked it with a scowl. "You've got a lot of confidence for someone who's forcing me to stay." Mila leaned back, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "Confidence is a luxury I can afford, Benjamin. But let me make this simple for you." She gestured to the bed around them. "You'll stay here. You'll share this space with me. And in return, I'll give you something no one else on this planet can. And what's that? He asked, his voice skeptical. Knowledge, she said, her tone serious. Answers to the questions that brought you here in the first place. About my people, my world, the mysteries of the universe that your fragile human mind can't even begin to comprehend. Benjamin frowned, his curiosity piqued despite himself. He'd been a part of the Vanguard Explorer for years, risking his life to uncover the secrets of the galaxy. But now, here he was, offered answers on a silver platter by an alien princess who seemed to enjoy toying with him. And all I have to do is, what, stay in your bed? He asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Mila smiled, leaning closer until their faces were only inches apart. Stay, she said softly. Talk to me. Let me unravel you piece by piece. Let me see the man beneath the bravado. Benjamin met her gaze, his green eyes searching hers for any hint of deception. He didn't trust her, not entirely, but there was something about her that made him want to, and that terrified him more than anything else. You're impossible, he muttered, lying back on the bed and staring up at the ceiling. And yet, Mila said, her voice a soft purr, you're still here. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, a charged energy that neither of them seemed willing to break. Benjamin closed his eyes, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know what Mila's true intentions were, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let her win. Not yet. But as he lay there, feeling the warmth of her presence beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Of what, he didn't know, but he intended to find out. On his terms, the faint hum of the energy bed seemed to mirror the tension between them as the hours slipped by. Benjamin wasn't sure how much time had passed since their last exchange. Sleep had eluded him, and every breath Mila took beside him was a reminder that he was a stranger in this world, at the mercy of a woman who both intrigued and infuriated him. Mila's voice broke the silence, low and velvety. You're restless, Benjamin. He opened his eyes to find her lying on her side, propped up on one elbow, her fiery orange hair spilling like liquid flame over the shimmering surface of the bed. Her gaze was piercing, yet softer now, laced with curiosity. Hard to sleep when I've got a force field blocking the door and an alien princess hovering over me, he said dryly. Mila's lips curled into a sly smile. You wound me. Do I make you nervous? You make me a lot of things, Benjamin replied, his tone sharp. Nervous isn't one of them. She chuckled softly, the sound warm and rich. Good, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I wouldn't want you to be afraid of me. Benjamin turned onto his side, facing her fully. His green eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller than it was. I'm not afraid of you, he said, his voice steady. I just don't trust you. Mila tilted her head, studying him. And why is that? He raised a brow, his expression incredulous. You kidnapped me, locked me in your chambers, and told me I belonged to you. Trust isn't exactly the first thing that comes to mind. Her smile widened, but there was a flicker of something else in her gaze, something that almost resembled vulnerability. You humans and your obsession with freedom, she mused. Tell me, Benjamin, what does freedom mean to you? The question caught him off guard. It means having control over my own life, he said after a moment. Making my own choices. Mila's eyes softened, and she leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. And yet, here you are, lying beside me. Was that your choice? Benjamin tensed, her words hitting closer to home than he cared to admit. He looked away, his jaw tightening. I didn't exactly have many options. Mila reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, and it sent a shiver through him despite himself. Perhaps, she said softly, but you're still here. You could fight harder, resist more, yet you stay. I'm not staying because I want to, he said, his voice rough. No? Mila's lips curved into a teasing smile. Then why are you still here, Benjamin? He didn't answer, and the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. Mila didn't press him further, but her gaze lingered on him, as though she could see straight through him. It was unnerving and oddly comforting at the same time. After a moment, Mila lay back, her fiery hair fanning out around her like a halo. She stared up at the crystalline ceiling, her expression thoughtful. Do you know why I brought you here? She asked quietly. I'm still trying to figure that out, Benjamin said, his voice laced with suspicion. It's not just because you're human, she said, her tone soft. It's because you're different, unpredictable. My people, we thrive on order, on structure. But you're chaos, Benjamin, and chaos fascinates me. He frowned, turning onto his back as he processed her words. You're telling me you dragged me halfway across the galaxy because you're bored? Mila laughed, a light, melodic sound that seemed to fill the room. Not bored, she said. Curious. You're a puzzle I can't resist. And the more I learn about you, the more I want to understand. Benjamin glanced at her, his green eyes narrowing. And what happens when you're done? When you've solved me? Mila's smile faded, and for the first time she looked almost uncertain. I don't know, she admitted. Perhaps that's why I'm so drawn to you, because I don't know what happens next. Her honesty surprised him, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. Mila was a mystery, an enigma wrapped in layers of confidence and vulnerability. He didn't trust her, not entirely, but there was a part of him that wanted to. A part of him that was just as curious about her as she seemed to be about him. Tell me something, he said finally, breaking the silence. Why me? Out of all the humans you could have chosen, why did you pick me? Mila turned her head, her blue eyes locking onto his. Because you're not afraid to challenge me, she said simply. Most people, alien or otherwise, see my crown and bow. But you look me in the eye and fight back. You make me feel, she paused, searching for the right word, alive. Benjamin's breath caught at the raw honesty in her voice. For a moment, the barriers between them felt thinner, as though they were two souls sharing the same space, the same air, the same unspoken connection. He turned his gaze back to the ceiling, his mind racing. He didn't know what this was or where it was heading, but one thing was clear. Mila wasn't the only one who was curious, and that terrified him more than anything else. The crystalline room was eerily silent, the hum of the energy bed the only sound, as Benjamin stared at Mila. She stood near the edge of the room, her fiery orange hair catching the light of the alien moon outside the translucent walls. Her back was to him, her posture unusually tense. For the first time since he'd arrived, she seemed uncertain, as though the weight of her own game had finally caught up to her. You've barely said a word since we woke up, Benjamin said, his voice breaking the silence. He sat on the edge of the bed, his green eyes locked on her. What's going on? Mila turned slowly, her blue eyes meeting his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The time has come, she said softly, her voice devoid of its usual teasing tone. For you to decide. Decide what? He asked, frowning. She took a step closer, her movements uncharacteristically hesitant. Whether you'll stay with me or leave. Benjamin blinked, caught off guard. He'd expected anything but this. I thought I didn't have a choice, he said, his tone edged with sarcasm. You didn't, Mila admitted. Not at first. But things have changed. Benjamin stood, his tall frame towering over her as he approached. What's changed, Mila? What's this really about? She hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment before she looked back up at him. I underestimated you, Benjamin, she said quietly. I thought you were just another human, a plaything, a distraction. But you've shown me something I didn't expect. You've made me question everything I thought I knew about myself, about my people, about what it means to care. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Benjamin's breath caught, and he took a step closer, his voice softening. Mila, she held up a hand, stopping him. No, she said, her voice firm. Let me finish. My people don't form bonds the way humans do. We don't feel the way you feel. At least, that's what I've always believed. But you've changed that. You've made me feel things I don't understand, things that scare me. Benjamin's chest tightened as he watched her, the raw vulnerability in her eyes, unlike anything he'd ever seen. Mila, you're free to leave, she said, cutting him off. Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. The force field is down. Your ship has been repaired. If you want to go, no one will stop you. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He should have felt relief, exhilaration, even triumph. But instead, all he felt was a hollow ache in his chest. He glanced toward the door, now open, its shimmering barrier gone. Freedom was within his grasp. All he had to do was walk away. And yet, he didn't move. You want me to leave? He asked, his voice low. Mila's expression faltered, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of pain in her eyes. What I want doesn't matter, she said softly. This is about you, your choice. Benjamin took a deep breath, his mind racing. He thought about everything he'd been through since arriving on her planet. The frustration, the defiance, the countless battles of wit and willpower. But he also thought about the moments in between, the way she'd looked at him, the way she'd spoken to him, the way she'd challenged him, and somehow made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. "You think letting me go is the right thing to do," he said, taking another step closer. "But what about what you want, Mila? Doesn't that matter?" Her eyes shimmered, and she looked away. "It doesn't change the fact that you don't belong here." Benjamin closed the distance between them, his hand gently tilting her chin so she was forced to look at him. "You're wrong," he said, his voice firm. "I didn't belong here. But now, I'm not so sure." Mila's lips parted, her breath hitching slightly as she searched his face. "Benjamin, you wanted to unravel me," he said, a small wry smile tugging at his lips. "But somewhere along the way you unraveled yourself, didn't you?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked almost fragile. But then, as if a switch had been flipped, her expression hardened. She stepped back, straightening her shoulders and lifting her chin. "It doesn't matter," she said, her tone sharp. "You have your ship. You can go." Benjamin stared at her, his jaw tightening. "You're really going to push me away, aren't you?" She didn't answer, her silence speaking volumes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The tension in the room was suffocating, and Benjamin felt his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the open door, then back at Mila, and he realized something that shook him to his core. He didn't want to leave. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped toward her. Mila stiffened, but she didn't move away. "If I leave," he said, his voice low and steady, "it won't be because you pushed me away. It'll be because I made the choice. And right now, my choice is to stay." Her breath caught, and she stared at him, her blue eyes wide with shock. "You would stay?" "I don't know what this is, Mila," he admitted, his voice softening, "but I'm not ready to walk away from it. From you." Tears glimmered in her eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. "Benjamin, He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek. "I'm not saying this is easy, or that it makes sense. But maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe it's enough that we're here now." Mila's lips trembled, and for the first time, she let her walls crumble. She stepped closer, her hand resting on his chest as she looked up at him. "You're a fool," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But so am I." Benjamin smiled, his hand cupping her face. "Then I guess we're in good company." The alien moonlight bathed them in its glow as they stood together, two souls from different worlds, finding something they never expected in each other. And for the first time since his arrival, Benjamin felt at peace. He had made his choice, and so had she.